Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Boomi how-to. This video is going to be part two to the accelerated API management setup course. This one we're going to be doing a advanced API type that uses a gateway to authenticate requests. Advanced API types different from the intermediate we did last time, as it requires a API component for it to actually function. So where we would be getting the endpoint path would be different, and since we're going through the gateway, we're going to be authenticating a little bit differently too. Step one for this would obviously be installing a gateway on your AtomSphere account and server. The gateway is essentially a modified Atom. It has a gravity sidecar that will handle most of the gateway aspects of what a gateway would do, such as storing APIs, plans, authentication, stuff like that. Um, it's a separate entity from the Atom as well. So typically you'll have it installed on two different machines. For this, we're going to have it on the same, just routing from two different ports. Um, with that, we can just hop right into it. So firstly, we're going to go to Services, API Management, Configure Server, Gateway, and we're going to add a new gateway. Same as last time, I'm using a Windows 64-bit machine, so that's what we're going to do. We'll install the installer, and we will generate a token and copy that token. I'm going to have to run that as administrator. Here we go. So same as before, we're going to use token, similar to the Atom. Paste our token here, and I'm going to name the gateway local test gateway. Click next. I'm fine with it installing there. I'll keep these as is for now. I don't want a shortcut. Give it some time to install it. Okay. So with that, the gateway has finished. The installer has finished. Close this. We see our gateway here. Right now it's offline, but it should be coming up soon. There we go. All right, so our gateway's up. Uh, we're already set the local host. I'll change the port because I believe there's another process running on 8070, but or 8077, so I'll do 8079. The bind address is okay. Public URL is what we're going to be using to call it. We'll set that to localhost, and we'll save it. For the environment, we're going to want to attach our gateway to the test environment. To do this, we can use the environment migration tool. which is up here. We'll click Environment Migration, Create New Migration. We'll select the environment, which is our test environment. We'll choose our local gateway. These are the paths that you specify for it to be able to route. So you can have a gateway attached to multiple environments. When you initially migrate a gateway onto a environment, it's going to ask you what path you want to use for the routing. So if, say, I wanted to go to test, I could do like /test and then save this. So if I called an endpoint with the localhost 8079 ws/rest/test, it would go to my test environment. If I had a production or like a QA gateway or a QA environment also attached to the gateway, and I migrated it on, I could specify it with like ws/rest/QA in the URL. And they, depending on what you provide, the client provides, it would route the request that way to that specific environment or backend. I'll just keep this as this for now, since we only have one environment. We don't need to worry about that. We'll save and continue, 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 and migrate. All right, and with that, our local test gateway is on our test environment. Next, we'll create a basic auth source to help authenticate our APIs when we eventually have a API deployed. To do this, we'll go to Configure Server, Authentication, create an auth source. We'll name this one Test Gateway Basic Auth. Keep the description empty, but we'll choose Basic Authentication Gateway as the identity provider type. Click OK. From here, we're going to navigate to the role and create our first role. This role will be test role. Click Save. Roles, basically, you can assign them to either to auth sources and have specific basically ruling for roles that you have, so you can limit the access of specific APIs based on role. So right now we have our first role, which is test node role, and we're gonna apply that role to a group. This will be test group. We'll choose our test role to associate it with. Finish. And then finally, we'll add our user. Test user. You can do the password as whatever you want. I'm just going to do 123. And we'll enable it. We'll associate it with the test group, which is associated with the test role. And we will finish that up. Finally, we'll save, which will send the authentication to the gateway for any of the deployed APIs. With the authentication setup, we'll set up a plan to use later on. To do this, we'll go to Configure Server Plans, create a plan. We'll name this one Gold. And we'll just keep all the size, the message size, the rate limit, and the quota limit all at unlimited. You can play around with these to see the how they work, but rate limit is basically how many APIs you can have at a time per specific time period. Message size, the size of the message that an API will be able to handle or is it will accept, and then the quota is the amount of APIs total you can have in a time period. But with that, we'll just go ahead and create that. So now we have our gold plan created. All right, with the gateway up, plan created, and the authentication source created, we're going to head back to our shared web server on our Atom runtime. To do that, we'll go to Services, Integration, Manage, Atom Management, Local Test Atom, Shared Web Server. We're going to change the API type from intermediate to advanced. This will cause the API you created in part one to no longer work with that endpoint. You will need a API component to be able to call that, and it will change the actual like URL there. But we'll get into how to do that a little bit later on. So with the API type set to advanced, we're going to add a port. I'll do 90, 98. We'll set this port to gateway, and we'll set it as the default port. We'll click Save and restart the plugin. So now our shared web server is configured to accept requests with the basic authentication we have here, using this user here, on port 9099, or from the gateway on port 9098. This will use the gateway auth, and it has to be called to the gateway first to be able to make any API calls there. All right, with that, we'll create our API component next. To do that, we'll go to Build, go to this plus button, and we can do API service, or from the API we already have created, we can just click this Create API button, which is a little bit easier, I think. And we will name this Hello World API. For the base path, we'll do heartbeat. The title, we'll just do Hello World API as well. We'll do version 1, keep the description blank. And we'll import this process. So this Hello World process will be our REST endpoint. And we'll create it. So here we see our Hello World process. This is our endpoint. To call this endpoint, it would be the gateway URL if you're calling it from the gateway, so that public gateway URL. Or you can use the shared web server on the basic auth port you have configured in your shared web server. You can call it either way. But we'll be doing it with our gateway later on. But it will be that as the base URL, and then WS REST heartbeat, and then hello world would be the full path. All right. With the API created, we can deploy them, both the API and the process again. You can do the create package component, or you can use the API lifecycle, which is my preferred way of doing it. Makes things a little bit easier, and it also deploys both the API component and associated process, so there's no room for error or user error when deploying. So we'll click Save and Deploy. Choose our test environment. Choose our gold plan. You can make a keyless or not. That would just require an API key, which we will get into when creating an API key when we get into the application section next. So we have our gold plan. Authentication. We'll choose our basic gateway, our test gateway basic auth that we created. We'll leave the roles blank for now. We don't have to worry about that. We'll keep the package version as empty. You can keep it as, you can change it to one, it's all up to your preference on that, but I'll keep it empty for this example. And we'll click package and deploy. So that will deploy the process and the API component to both our local test atom and our local test gateway, because both of those devices are associated with the test environment. Okay, with that deployed, we're going to go and create an application. To do that, we'll go to Configure APIs and Applications, Application, Create Application. We'll choose our local test gateway. Application name will be Hello World. And you can add or leave blank the application owner information. It's up to your preference. We'll click Save. And the application is created and on our local gateway. Now we're going to have to subscribe to this application with one of our APIs. To do this, we can just click on the subscriptions hyperlink under the subscription column, and we'll click the subscribe button. We'll choose the Hello World API we have. We'll choose our gold plan. We'll start it right now. And we have subscribed to the Hello World application with our Hello World API. And you can see it generated an API key. All right, with that, we're gonna finally make the call to our API from our gateway using Postman. So I'll pull up Postman. Firstly, I'm just going to copy the API key just so we have it. API key we can add as a header. We'll do that first. And that's just x dash API slash key. And we'll paste the value right there. Next will be the actual gateway. So we'll go to Configure Server Gateways, our local gateway, go to the location settings and copy our URL, our public URL. Paste that there. I'm gonna turn off my parameters. I don't need these right now. And then for the full path, we could either get it from the component itself, or to make it easier, we'll go to Configure App APIs and Applications, Deployed APIs, click on View for our Hello World API, go to the REST tab, and for the list of endpoints under the local test gateway, we can just copy this, and this will give us the full path. Paste that there. All right, and then the authorization is the last thing. We can just grab it from here. I forget the username, so I'm just going to go here to remember it. So just test user. And we will send it. And we got a connection refused. Let me double check something to see if there was anything I missed. Okay, so the issue was the bind address for my location settings. I had this set to 8077 with the public IP address set to 8079. I just changed the bind address to match the public address. So basically, because you're calling localhost on this and this, you want them to match. They don't necessarily need the match. For like an external, like if you have an external device in front, but since for the purposes of this example, since we're calling it on our local machine from localhost, these two need the match. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Make sure these ports match on the bind address and the public URL. You can click save. All right, and then we'll pull back up Postman. So we have it. We're calling localhost 8079, web service, REST, heartbeat, hello world with our authentication. Click send, and we get back hello world, which was what we could originally configured in our process in part one. All right, and that brings us to the end of part two of this course, this accelerated course. To summarize, we set up a gateway, configured and deployed a API component, created a plan, and created a basic auth source, and created an application. Then we called it and got a 200 good response. All right. Thank you for watching and have a great rest of your day.